On this day in history, April 1st, 1081, Alexios I Komnenos overthrows the Byzantine Emperor Nicephorus III Botaniates, and, after his troops spend 3 days extensively looting Constantinople, is formally crowned on April 4th. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Alexios. Alexios I, born 1048, died 1118, Emperor of the East, was the third son of John Komnenos, nephew of Isaac Komnenos, Emperor from 1057 to 59. His father declined the throne on the abdication of Isaac, who was accordingly succeeded by 4 emperors of families between that date and 1081. Under one of these emperors, Romanus Diogenes 1067-71, he served with distinction against the Seljuk Turks. Under Michael Peloponneses 1071-78 and Nikephoros Botaniates 1078-81, he was also employed, along with his elder brother Isaac, against rebels in Asia Minor, Thrace and Eniprius 1071. The success of the Komneni roused the jealousy of Botaniates and his ministers, and the Komneni were almost compelled to take up arms in self-defense. Botaniates was forced to abdicate and retire to a monastery, and Isaac declined the crown in favor of his younger brother Alexius, who then became emperor in the 33rd year of his age. His long reign of nearly 37 years was full of difficulties. At the very outset, he had to meet the formidable attack of the Normans, Robogiscard and his son Bohemond, who took Dyrrhachium and Corfu and laid siege to Larissa in Thessaly. The Norman danger ended for the time with Robert Guiscard's death, 1085, and the conquests were recovered. He had next to repel the invasions of Pechenegs, and Cumans in Thrace, with whom the Manichaean sects of the Pelusians and Bogomilians made common cause. And thirdly, he had to cope with the fast-growing power of the Turks in Asia Minor. Above all, he had to meet the difficulties caused by the arrival of the warriors of the First Crusade, which had been in a great degree initiated owing to the representations of his own ambassadors, though the help which he wanted from the West was simply mercenary forces and not the immense hosts which arrived to his consternation and embarrassment. The first part under Peter the Hermit he got rid of by sending them on to Asia Minor, where they were massacred by the Turks, 1096. The second, and much more serious host of warriors, led by Godfrey of Bouillon, he conducted also into Asia, promising to supply them with provisions in return for an oath of homage, and by their victories recovered for the empire a number of important cities and islands: Nicaea, Chios, Rhodes, Smyrna, Ephesus, Philadelphia, Sardis, and in fact most of Asia Minor, 1097-99. This is ascribed as a credit to his policy and diplomacy by his daughter, by the Latin historians of the Crusade to his treachery and falseness. The last 20 years of his life were marked by persecution of followers of the Paulician and Bogomilian heresies. One of his last acts was to burn Basilis, a Bogomilian leader, with whom he had engaged in a theological controversy. By renewed struggles with the Turks, 1110-17, and by anxieties as to the succession, which his wife Irene wished to alter in favor of her daughter Anne's husband, Nicephorus Bryennius, for whose benefit the special title Panhypersbastos, i.e., as it were, Augustissimos, si quis alios, was created. This intrigue disturbed even his dying hours. He deserves the credit of having raised the empire from a condition of anarchy and decay at a time when it was threatened on all sides by new dangers. No emperor devoted himself more laboriously, or with a greater sense of duty, to the task of ruling. On this day in history, April 2nd, 1513, having spotted land on March 27th, Spanish explorer Juan Ponce de Leon comes ashore on what is now the state of Florida, landing somewhere between the modern city of St. Augustine and the mouth of the St. Johns River. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of discovery and settlement of Florida. The romance and the tragedies of the early history of Florida give it a unique place in the annals of the American states. Within 20 years after the first voyage of Columbus to the New World in 1492, an expedition was being organized to seek for a fabulous fountain of youth and for riches in the new and inviting land. This expedition was followed by others seeking wealth or to establish the Christian faith among the savages. In turn, these were followed by French Huguenots, who were seeking a place of religious freedom, but the zeal of the Spaniards soon brought an unhappy end to their search. Florida also has the honor of containing the oldest European settlement within the bounds of the original United States, as St. Augustine was founded in 1565, 42 years before the English were successful at Jamestown. The Spanish Council of the Indies claimed that since 1510, fleets and ships had gone to Florida, and Florida is shown on the earliest known map of the New World, the Cantino map of 1502. In 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon, circa 1460, died 1521, who had been with Christopher Columbus on his second voyage and later been governor of Puerto Rico, obtained a royal grant authorizing him to discover and settle Bimini, a fabulous island believed to contain a marvelous fountain or spring whose waters would restore to old men their youth or, at least, had wonderful curative powers. Soon after Easter Day, he came in sight of the coast of Florida, probably near the mouth of the St. Johns River. From the name of the day in the calendar, Pascua Florida, or from the fact that many flowers were found on the coast, the country was named Florida. De Leon seems to have explored the coast, to some degree, on both sides of the peninsula, and to have turned homeward fully convinced that he had discovered an immense island. He returned to Spain in 1514 and obtained from the king a grant to colonize the island of Bimini and the island of Florida, of which he was appointed adelantado, civil and military governor. And in 1521 he made another expedition, this one for colonization as well as for discovery. He seems to have touched at the island of Tortugas, so named on account of the large number of turtles found there, and to have landed at several other places, but many of his men succumbed to disease and himself was wounded in an Indian attack, dying soon afterwards in Cuba. Meanwhile, in 1516, another Spaniard, Diego Morello, seems to have sailed for some distance along the west coast of the peninsula. The next important expedition was that of Panfilo de Narvaez. In 1527 he sailed from Cuba with about 600 men, soon reduced to less than 400. He landed early in 1528, probably at the present site of Pensacola, and for 6 months remained in the country, he and his men suffering terribly from exposure, hunger, and fierce Indian attacks. In September, his ships being lost and his force greatly reduced in number, he hastily constructed a fleet of 5 boats, re-embarked, probably to sea while off the coast of Texas. Only 4 of his men, including Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, succeeded after 8 years of Indian captivity and of long and weary wanderings, in finding their way to the Spanish settlements in Mexico. Florida was also partially explored by Fernando de Soto in 1539-40. In the summer of 1559, another attempt at colonization was made by Tristan de Luna, who sailed from Veracruz, landed at Pensacola Bay, and explored a part of Florida and, possibly, southern Alabama. Somewhere in the region he desired to make a permanent settlement, but he was abandoned by most of his followers and gave up his attempt in 1561. On this day in history, April 3rd, 1043, Edward the Confessor is crowned King of England. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Edward. Edward the Confessor died 1066, so called on account of his reputation for sanctity. King of the English, was the son of Ethelred II, the Unready, and Emma, daughter of Richard, Duke of Normandy, and was born at Islip in Oxfordshire. On the recognition of Svein as King of England in 1013, Ethelred, with his wife and family, took refuge in Normandy, and Edward continued to reside at the Norman court until he was recalled in 1041 by Hardicanute. He appears to have been formally recognized as heir to the throne, if not actually associated in the kinship, and on the death of Hardicanute in 1042, all folk received to be king, though his actual coronation was delayed until Easter 1043. A few months later, Edward, in conjunction with the 3 great earls of the kingdom, made a raid on the Queen Mother Ealhgefu, or Emma, seized all her possessions, and compelled her to live in retirement. In the earlier years of the reign, the influence of Earl Goodwine was predominant, though not unopposed. His daughter Edith, or Eadgith, became Edward's queen in 1045, But the king's personal tastes inclined much more to foreigners than to Englishmen, and he fell more and more into the hands of foreign favorites from beyond the sea. Between Godwin, representing the spirit of nationalism, and these favorites, especially their leader, Robert of Jumièges, successively Bishop of London and Archbishop of Canterbury, there was war to the knife. In 1046, Magnus, King of Norway, who had succeeded Hardknut in Denmark, had claimed to succeed him in England as well, threatened an invasion, but the necessity of defending Denmark against his rival Svein Estrithson prevented him from carrying it into effect. In 1049, Godwin's son Svein, who had been outlawed for the seduction of Abbess of Leominster, returned and demanded his restoration. This was refused, and Svein returned into exile, but not before he had with foulest treachery murdered his young kinsman Bjorn. He was, however, inlawed next year. The influence of Godwin, already shaken, received a severe blow in 1051 in the appointment of Robert Jumièges to the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the same year saw the triumph of the foreigners for the moment complete. Edward, indignant at the resistance offered by the men of Dover to the insolence of his brother-in-law Eustace of Boulogne and his French followers, ordered Godwin to punish the town. Godwin refused. The king, at the prompting of the archbishop, then summoned a meeting of the Witan, at which the old charge against Godwin of complicity in the murder of Etheling Alfred was to be revived. About the same time came news of a fresh outrage by the foreigners. Godwin gathered his forces and demanded redress, while the Earls Leofric of Mercia and Siverd of Northumbria hastened to the side of the king. Civil war seemed imminent, but at length a compromise was effected by which the matter was referred to a meeting of the Witan to be held at London. At the appointed time Godwin presented himself at Southwark, but his followers were rapidly deserting him, nor would the king give hostages for his security. Alarmed for his safety, he fled to Flanders, where his son Harold went to Ireland, but their exile was brief. The tale of Godwin excited universal sympathy, for he represented the cause of national independence. Encouraged by assurances from England, he sailed thither, and joining forces with Harold, sailed along the south coast and up the Thames. The king would have resisted, but found no support. Yielding to circumstances, he allowed himself to be reconciled, and Godwin and his house were restored to their old position. The queen at the same time was brought back from the monastery at Werwell, whither she had been dispatched at her father's flight. The foreigners had already ignominiously fled the country, and thenceforth the influence of Godwin, and, after his death, of Harold, was supreme. In 1063 Harold made a great expedition into Wales, in which he crushed the power of King Gruffudd, who was killed by his own people. But despite his prowess and his power, he was the minister of the king rather than his personal favorite. This latter position belonged to his younger brother Tostig, who, on the death of Siverd in 1055, was appointed Earl of Northumbria. Here, Tostig's severity and arbitrary temper rendered him intensely unpopular, and in 1065 Tostig's subjects broke into revolt. They elected Morkere as their earl, then, marching south, demanded Tostig's banishment. Edward desired to crush the revolt by force of arms, but he was overborne and forced to submit. The election of Morkere was recognized, and Tostig went into exile, intensely mortified at this humiliation, and henceforth his health failed rapidly. He was unable to be present at the consecration of his new abbey of Westminster, the foundation of which had been the chief interest of his closing years, and on January 5th, 1066, he died. The virtues of Edward were monkish rather than kingly. In the qualities of a ruler, he was conspicuously deficient. Always dependent on others, he ever inclined to be the unworthier master, but the charm of his character for the monastic biographer, and the natural tendency to glorify the days before the Norman oppression began, combined to cast about his figure a halo which had not attached to it in life. Allowed to keep her property by William the Conqueror, his widow, Edith, passed the remainder of her life at Windsor, dying on December 19th, 1075. On this day in history, April 4th, 801, King Louis the Pious captures Barcelona from the Moors after a siege of several months. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Barcelona. During the Roman period, Barcino, a town of the Lusitani, raised to the rank of a colony under the name of Julia Faventia, afterwards Agudi, and Pia, gradually replaced Tarragona, as a seaport. The Bar-Huluna of the Muslims, who captured it in 713, it became, after its reconquest by the Franks in 801, the chief town of Marca Hispanica, and, by the end of the 9th century, of the independent countship of Barcelona, with recognized supremacy over its neighbors. The union in 1137 of Catalonia and Aragon was followed by the rise of political importance of the wealthy merchant class, from which were elected, at first exclusively, the members of the municipal council, Consell de Cent, of Barcelona. Barcelona now became one of the foremost trading cities of the Mediterranean, the rival of Genoa and Venice, and its maritime code, Libro del Consulo del Mar, dating from the late 13th century, was for long widely recognized as authoritative. By 1479, the date of the union of Aragon and Castile, the city had directed its direct jurisdiction by the technical inclusion within the municipality of protected areas scattered over eastern Spain, and exercised a virtual hegemony over the rest of the seaboard of Aragon. In municipal politics, a democratic tradition had been established by the entry to the council and final predominance there of representatives of the popular classes. Marked independence of the central authority had already been shown by the successful resistance of the city to John II of Aragon during the 10 years ending in 1473. The relations of Barcelona with the new central government were prejudiced by the monopoly of the American trade granted to Andalusia, which persisted until 1778. In 1640, a flirtation with France and the revival in favor of Louis XIV of the title of Count of Barcelona was illustrative of a tendency to play off a third party against Madrid rather than any serious leanings towards France. During the War of the Succession, Barcelona was taken in 1705 by the English under the Earl of Peterborough, and the Archduke Charles was enthusiastically welcomed by the population, who paid the price of their enthusiasm when Concile de Cent was abolished by Philip V after the recapture of the city in 1714. By this, and by the suppression of the Catalan fueros in general, relations with Madrid were further embittered. No permanent traces were left of the French occupation of Barcelona between 1809 and 1813. In the modern period since 1815, the history of Barcelona has been marked by episodes indicative of social, industrial, or political unrest. The combination of different forms of unrest in one complex movement by characteristics of the city. Especially serious were the uprisings of 1835, when 11 convents were destroyed, and of the tragic week in 1909, when over 60 churches and religious buildings disappeared from the city's architectural inheritance. The infantry committees of defense had their headquarters here in 1916, and it was here that the movement began which led to the establishment of the military directory in 1923. The evolution of the labor movement from the earlier Pacific phase of the General Workers' Union, Unión General de Trabajadores, founded at the Second Barcelona Congress in 1888, to the phase characterized by the terrorist action of Sindicato Único led to the revolutionary strike of 1919 and 1920. Barcelona was also the headquarters of the Catalonian separatist movement, and on August 2, 1936, following the outbreak of civil war in Spain, it became the seat of an autonomous Catalonian government. It was a main center of government strength. Nationalist superiority in air and artillery strength caused the city to fall into rebel hands January 26, 1939, almost without resistance. The fall of Barcelona, with its great industrial facilities, doomed the government cause and led to its final surrender in the following March. Barcelona suffered from air attack during the war, notably a 3-day raid in 1938. On this day in history, April 5th, 823, Lothair I is crowned King of Italy by Pope Paschal I. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the life of Lothair. Lothair I, born 795, died 855, Roman Emperor, was the eldest son of the Emperor Louis I and his wife Ermengarde. Little is known of his early life, which was probably passed at the court of his grandfather Charlemagne, until 815, when he became ruler of Bavaria. When Louis in 817 divided the empire between his sons, Lothair was crowned joint emperor at Aix-la-Chapelle and given a certain superiority over his brothers. In 821 he married Ermengarde, died 851, daughter of Hugo, Count of Tours. In 822 undertook the government of Italy, and on April 5, 823, was crowned emperor by Pope Paschal I at Rome. In November 824, he promulgated a statute which reserved the supreme power to the secular potentate, and he afterwards issued ordinances for the good government of Italy. On his return to his father's court, his stepmother Judith persuaded him to secure a kingdom for her son Charles, a scheme which was carried out in 829. Lothair, however, soon changed his attitude, and spent the succeeding decade in constant strife over the division of the empire with his father. He was alternately master of the empire, and banished and confined to Italy, at one time taking up arms in alliance with his brothers, and at another fighting against them, whilst the bounds of his appointed kingdom were in turn extended and reduced. When Louis was dying in 840, he sent the imperial insignia to Lothair, who, disregarding the various partitions, claimed the whole of the empire. Negotiations with his brother Louis and his half-brother Charles, both of whom armed to resist this claim, were followed by an alliance of the younger brothers against Lothair. A decisive battle was fought at Fontenoy on June 25, 841, when, in spite of his personal gallantry, Lothair was defeated and fled to Aix. With fresh troops, he entered upon a war of plunder, but he was compelled to surrender Aix to his brothers. In June 842, the brothers met on an island in the Saône and agreed to an arrangement which eventually developed into the Treaty of Verdun, 843. By this, Lothair received Italy and the imperial title, together with a stretch of land between the North and Mediterranean seas lying along the valleys of the Rhine and the Rhone. He abandoned Italy to his eldest son Louis, and remained in his new kingdom, engaged in alternate quarrels and reconciliations with his brothers, and in efforts to defend his lands from the attacks of Normans and the Saracens. In 855 he fell ill, and divided his lands between his 3 sons. On September 23rd, he entered the monastery of Prüm, where he died 6 days later. On this day in history, April 6th, 46 BC, Julius Caesar defeats Caecilius Metellus Scipio and Marcus Porcius Cato, Cato the Younger, at the Battle of Thapsus. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. Battle of Thapsus, 47 BC. After his victory at Pharsalus, Julius Caesar followed Pompey to Egypt, where the Pompeians accumulated a large army and were joined by Juba, king of Numidia. A battle was fought at Ruspina, in which Caesar was almost overwhelmed, after which he moved to Veta and besieged it, withdrew on account of lack of supplies, and in order to compel Scipio to battle, marched on Thapsus, an ancient city of North Africa in the province of Byzacium, the modern province of Tunis, on the coast more than 100 miles north of Carthage. Thapsus contained large military stores, was strongly garrisoned, and blockaded by Caesar's fleet. On February 4th, 47 BC, he arrived before the city and immediately besieged it. This drove Scipio into action, for he at once advanced on Thapsus and threw up 2 entrenched camps, one for his own men and the other for Juba's 8 miles south of the city. The maneuvers which are now followed were controlled by a saltwater lake, the modern Sebka de Moknine, which lies to the southwest of Thapsus. Caesar had entirely surrounded the town, but Scipio considered that it was still possible to relieve it from the south. Caesar had foreseen the likelihood of this move, and had built a strong fort in the center of the strip of land which separates the eastern margin of the lake from the sea. When Scipio advanced, he struck this fort, and being unable to take it, turned back and decided to march round the lake and force the northern approach to the city. This he did, and constructed 2 camps north of the lake. Though Caesar would have preferred to defer battle until he had taken Thapsus, he now determined to attack Scipio before he had finished his entrenchments. Leaving Asprenas, the proconsul, and 2 legions to carry on the siege, with the rest of his force he marched against Scipio. One half of his fleet he left to continue the blockade, and the other he ordered to sail down the coast and make a demonstration against Scipio's rear. Placing his left on the coast, Scipio drew up his army in 3 lines, with his elephants and light troops in front of his right and left wings, his Numidian cavalry on the left, and the rest of his cavalry and light troops on the right. Advancing on him, Caesar also extended his army into 3 lines with the 2nd and 10th legions on the right, the 8th and the 9th on the left, and 5 legions in the center. His flanks he covered by 5 chosen cohorts, supported by archers, slingers, and cavalry. As Scipio's camp was but half dug, Caesar's men wished to advance at once. Caesar, however, was not overly anxious to precipitate the battle, because he was largely outnumbered by the Numidian cavalry. Whilst he hesitated, the 10th Legion suddenly sounded the charge, which was repeated all down the line. The archers and slingers soon overwhelmed Scipio's elephants with their arrows and stones, driving them back on their own line, where they not only demoralized the infantry, but scattered the left-wing horse. The infantry lines then clinched, fighting each other until sunset, when Scipio's right wing became demoralized. This affected the center, and soon the entire line broke and sought refuge in the half-completed camp, which was speedily captured by a double envelopment of Caesar's wings. Scipio's force was annihilated in an awful slaughter, of which Mommsen writes, "If the hydra with which they fought always put forth new energies, if the army was hurried from Italy to Spain, from Spain to Macedonia, from Macedonia to Africa, and if the repose ever more eagerly longed for never came, the soldier sought, and not wholly without cause, the reason of this state of things in the unseasonable clemency of Caesar. 50,000 corpses were strewn over the battlefield of Thapsus, and among them were several Caesarian officers known as opponents to the new monarchy." In this battle, neither strategy nor tactics are remarkable, but what is so is the insubordination of the men and their growing sense of mastership in the new order which Caesar was creating. He wished to found an empire, and aimed at a complete victory, constantly taking tremendous risks and ignoring the units. The soldiers wanted peace so that they could return to their homes and families. At Thapsus, a battle was begun between the will of Caesar and the desires of his men. It was slow and progressive, and did not end until Alaric had sacked Rome. On this day in history, April 7th, 451, Attila the Hun captures Metz in France, killing most of its inhabitants and burning the town. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of the town. Metz, the Roman Divodurum, was the chief town of the Medio Matrici, and was also called by the Romans Medio Matricia. Metz is a contracted form. Caesar describes it as one of the oldest and most important towns in Gaul. The Romans, recognizing its strategic importance, fortified it, and supplied it with water by an imposing aqueduct, the remains of which still exist. Under the Roman emperors, Metz was connected by military roads with Toul, Langres, Lyon, Strasbourg, Verdun, Reims, and Trier. Christianity was introduced in the 3rd century. In the middle of the 5th century, the town was plundered by the Huns under Attila. Later, it came into possession of the Franks, and was made the capital of Austrasia. On the patrician of the Carolingian realms in 843, Metz fell to the share of the Emperor Lothair I as the capital of Lorraine. Its bishops, whose creation reaches back to the 4th century, now began to be very powerful. Metz became a free imperial town in the 13th century, and soon became prosperous. Having adopted the Reformed doctrines in 1552 and 1553, it fell to the hands of the French, and was defended against Charles V by Francis, Duke of Guise. At the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, Metz, with Toul and Verdun, was formally ceded to France. It was taken by the Germans in 1870, and ceded to them in 1871. It was retroceded to France after World War I, but was occupied again by the Germans in June 1940 during World War II. On this day in history, April 8th, 1250, as part of the 7th Crusade, the Ayyubids of Egypt captured King Louis IX of France in the Battle of Fariscour. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of the 7th Crusade. As the loss of Jerusalem in 1187 produced the 3rd Crusade, so its loss in 1244 produced the 7th. As the preaching of the 5th Crusade had taken place in the Lateran Council of 1215, so that of the 7th Crusade began in the Council of Lyon of 1245. But the preaching of the Crusade by Innocent IV at Lyon was a curious thing. On the one hand, he repeated the provisions of the 4th Lateran Council on behalf of the Crusade to the Holy Land. On the other hand, he preached a crusade against Frederick II, and promised to all who would join the full benefits of absolution and remission of sins. While the papacy thus bent its energies to the destruction of the Crusades in their genuine sense, and preferred to use it for its own political objects what was meant for Jerusalem, a layman took up the derelict cause, with all the religious zeal which any pope had ever displayed. Paradoxically enough, it was now the turn for the papacy to exploit the name of crusade for political ends, as the laity had done before, and it was left to the laity to champion the spiritual meaning of the crusade even against the papacy. It was at the end of the year in which Jerusalem had fallen that St. Louis had taken the cross, and by all means in his power he attempted to ensure the success of his projected crusade. He sought to mediate, though with no success, between the Pope and the Emperor. He descended to a whimsical piety, and took his courtiers by guile in distributing to them, at Christmas, clothing on which a cross had been secretly stitched. He started in 1248 with a gallant company, which contained his 3 brothers and the Sieur de Joinville, his biographer, and after withering in Cyprus, he directed his army in the spring of 1249 against Egypt. The objective was unexpected. It may have been chosen by St. Louis, because he knew how seriously the power of the Sultan was undermined by the Mamluks, who were in the very next year to depose the Ayyubid dynasty, which had reigned since 1171, and to substitute one of their number as Sultan. Damietta was taken without a blow, and the march for Cairo was begun, as it had been begun by the legate Pelagius in 1221. Again, the invading army halted before Mansoura, December 1249. Again, it had to retreat. The retreat became a rout. St. Louis was captured, and a treaty was made by which he had to consent to evacuate Damietta and pay a ransom of 800,000 pieces of gold. Eventually, he was released on surrendering Damietta and paying 1/2 of his ransom, and by the middle of May 1250 he reached Acre, having abandoned the Egyptian expedition. For the next 4 years he stayed in the Holy Land, seeking to do what he could for the establishing of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He was able to do but little. The struggle of papacy and empire paralyzed Europe, and even in France itself there were few ready to answer the calls for help which St. Louis sent home from Acre. The one answer was the Shepherd's Crusade, or Crusade of the Pastoraux, a religious jacquerie, as it had been called by Dean Milman. It had some of the features of the Children's Crusade in 1212. That, too, had begun with a shepherd boy. The leader of the Pastoraux, like the leader of the children, promised to lead his followers dry-shod through the seas, and tradition even said that this leader, Master of Hungary, as he was called, was the Stephen of the Children's Crusade. But the anti-clerical feeling and action of the shepherds was new and ominous, and moved by its enormities, the government suppressed the new movement ruthlessly. None came to the aid of St. Louis, and in 1254, on the death of his mother, Blanche, the regent, he had to return to France. On this day in history, April 9th, 1241, as part of the Battle of Liegnitz, Mongol forces defeat the Polish and German armies. Included in the following is the excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Liegnitz. Liegnitz, a town in the Prussian province of Silesia, Germany, on the Katzbach, just above its junction with the Schwarzwasser, and 40 miles west by northwest of Breslau, on the main line of railway to Berlin via Sommerfeld. Population of 1939, 83,000. Liegnitz is first mentioned in an historical document in the year 1004. In 1163 it became the seat of the Dukes of Liegnitz, who greatly improved and enlarged it, and who are buried in the Church of St. John. On the death of the last Duke of Liegnitz in 1675, the duchy came into the possession of the Empire, which retained it until the Prussian conquest of Silesia in 1742. On August 15, 1760, Frederick the Great gained a decisive victory near Liegnitz over the Austrians. It consists of an old town and several suburbs. The palace, formerly the residence of the Dukes of Liegnitz, and rebuilt after a fire in 1835, is used as the administration offices of the district. The Ritter Akademie, founded by the Emperor Joseph I, was reconstructed as a gymnasium in 1810. The Church of Saints Peter and Paul, restored 1892 to 1894, dates from the 14th century. The manufactures are considerable, the chief articles made being cloth, wool, leather, tobacco, pianos, clogs, sugar, carriages, and machinery. Its trade in grain and its cattle makers are likewise important. There are large market gardens in the suburbs. On this day in history, April 10th, 428, Nestorius becomes the Patriarch of Constantinople. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the Patriarch. Nestorius died circa 451, Syrian ecclesiastic, Patriarch of Constantinople from 428 to 431, was a native of Germanica at the foot of Mount Taurus in Syria. The year of his birth is unknown. He received his education at Antioch, probably under Theodore of Mopsuestia, as a monk in the neighboring monastery of Euprepius, and afterwards as presbyter. He became famous in the diocese for his aestheticism, his orthodoxy, and his eloquence. He was nominated by Theodosius II, Patriarch of Constantinople, and was consecrated on April 10, 428. He immediately set out to work to extirpate heresy in his diocese, beginning by the suppression of the assemblies of the Arians. These, by a bold stroke of policy, anticipated his action by themselves setting fire to their meeting house, Nestorius being forthwith nicknamed the Incendiary. His repression of the Novatians and the Quartodecimians led to serious disturbances at Sardis and Miletus. The toleration the followers of Macedonius had long enjoyed was also broken, the recently settled Pelagians alone finding any respite. One of the practices assailed by Nestorius was the custom, which had become almost universal in Constantinople, of bestowing the epithet Otokos, Mother of God, upon Mary, the Mother of Jesus. From Antioch, Nestorius had brought along with him to Constantinople a co-presbyter named Anastasius, who enjoyed his confidence and is called by Theophanes his Synecellus. This Anastasius, in a pulpit oration which the patriarch himself is said to have prepared for him, caused great scandal to the partisans of the cult of Mary by saying, "Let no one call Mary the Mother of God, for Mary was a human being, and that God should be born of a human being is impossible." Cyril of Alexandria seized his opportunity. He stirred up his own clergy. He encouraged the dissidents of Constantinople. He addressed himself to the sister and wife of the emperor, and he bribed the officials of the court. He also sent to Rome a careful selection of Nestorius' sayings and sermons. Nestorius himself, on the other hand, having occasion to write to Pope Celestine I about the Pelagians, whom he was not inclined to regard as heretical, gave from his own point of view an account of the disputes which had recently arisen within his patriarchate. Celestine naturally resented any questioning of the Roman decision concerning the Pelagians, and was jealous of the growing power of the Constantinople see. In a synod which met in 430, he decided in favor of the title Oektokos, bade Nestorius retract his erroneous teaching on pain of instant excommunication, and entrusted the execution of this decision to the Patriarch of Alexandria. In this situation of affairs, the demand for a general council became irresistible, and accordingly Theodosius and Valentinian III issued letters summoning the metropolitans of the Catholic Church to meet at Ephesus at Whitsuntide, 431, each bringing with him some able suffragans. Nestorius with 16 bishops and armed following, Cyril with 50 bishops, Juvenal of Jerusalem, and Flavian of Thessalonica arrived. John of Antioch was delayed on his journey, and wrote requesting that the opening of the synod should not be delayed on his account. Cyril and his friends assembled in the church of the Theotokos on June 22nd, and summoned Nestorius to give an account of his doctrines. He replied that he would appear when all the bishops were assembled, and the imperial commissioner, Candidian, formally protested against the opening of the synod. Cyril and the 159 bishops who were with him nevertheless proceeded to read the imperial letter of convocation, and afterwards the letters which had passed between Nestorius and Cyril. The entire assembly then cried anathema on Nestorius and his doctrines, and the decree of his exclusion from the episcopate and from all priestly communion was solemnly read and signed by all present. The accused and his friends never had a hearing. The populace accompanied the members with torches and censers to their lodgings, and there was a general illumination of the city. A few days afterwards, June 26th or 27th, John of Antioch arrived. Whether inclined or not to the cause of his former co-presbyter, he disapproved of the precipitancy with which Cyril had acted, and at the conciliabulum of 43 bishops held in his lodgings, he was induced by Candidian, the friend of Nestorius, to depose the bishops of Alexandria and Ephesus on the spot. The Ephesians intervened to prevent the execution of this decision on the next Sunday. Meanwhile, a letter from the emperor declared invalid the session at which Nestorius had been deposed unheard. Numerous sessions and counter-sessions were afterwards held, the conflicting parties both seeking the imperial support. In the end, Theodosius decided to confirm the depositions which had been pronounced on both sides, and Cyril and Memnon, as well as Nestorius, were by his orders laid under arrest. Representatives from each side were now summoned before him to Chalcedon, and at last, yielding to the sense of the evident majority, he gave a decision in favor of the Orthodox, and the Council of Ephesus was dissolved. Maximian, one of the Constantinopolitan clergy, a native of Rome, was promoted to the vacant see, and Nestorius was henceforth represented in the capital only by one congregation, which presently became extinct. But the Antiochnes maintained for some time an attitude of antagonism towards Cyril and his creed, and were not pacified until an understanding was reached in 433 on the basis of a new formula involving some concessions by him. The union even then was opposed by certain bishops who were deposed from their sees. Their school of Edessa was closed by Zeno in 489. Immediately after his disposition, Nestorius withdrew into private life in his old monastery of Euprepius, Antioch, until 435, when the emperor ordered his banishment to Persia in Arabia. A second decree, it would seem, sent him to Oasis, probably the city of the great Oasis in Upper Egypt, where he was still living in 493 at the time when Socrates wrote his church history. He was taken prisoner by the Blemmies, a nomad tribe that gave much trouble to the empire in Africa, and when they set him free in the Thebaid near Panopolis, Akhmim, circa 450, they exposed him to further persecution from Shenu, the hero of the Egyptian monks. There is some evidence that he was summoned to the Council of Chalcedon, though he could not attend it, and in the concluding portion of his book known as The Bazaar of Heraclides, he not only gives a full account of the robber synod of Ephesus 499, but knows that Theodosius is dead, July 450, and seems aware of the proceedings of Chalcedon and the flight of Dioscorus, the unscrupulous successor of Cyril at Alexandria. Nestorius was already old and ailing and must have died very soon after. There are still Nestorians in Kurdistan, and the Syriac Church is Nestorian in theology, as are the churches in Asia founded by Nestorian missionaries in the Middle Ages. On this day in history, April 11th, 491, Flavius Anastasius becomes Byzantine emperor, with the name of Anastasius I. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of Anastasius. Anastasius I, born circa 430, died 518, Roman emperor, was born at Dyrrhachium no later than AD 430. At the time of the death of Zeno, 491, Anastasius, a palace official, Silentiarius, bore a very high character, and was raised to the throne of the Roman Empire of the East, through the choice of Ariadne, Zeno's widow, who married him shortly after his ascension. His reign, though afterwards disturbed by foreign and intestine wars and religious distractions, commenced auspiciously. He gained popular favor by a judicious remission of taxation, and displayed great vigor and energy in administering the affairs of the empire. The principal wars in which Anastasius was engaged were those known as the Isaurian and the Persian Wars. The former, 492 to 496, was stirred up by the supporters of Longinus, the brother of Zeno. The victory at Cottium in 493 broke the back of the revolt, but a guerrilla warfare continued in the Isaurian mountains for some years longer. In the war with Persia, 502 to 505, Theodosiopolis and Amida were captured by the enemy, but the Persian provinces also suffered severely, and the Romans recovered Amida. Both adversaries were exhausted when peace was made, 506, on the basis of status quo. In 507, Anastasius built the strong fortress of Daras to hold Nisibis in check. The Balkan provinces were devastated by invasions of Slavs and Bulgarians. To protect Constantinople and its vicinity against them, he built the Anastasian Wall in 512, extending from the Propontis to the Euxine. The emperor was a convinced Monophysite, but his ecclesiastical policy was moderate. He endeavored to maintain the principle of the henetikon of Zeno and the peace of the Church. It was the uncompromising attitude of the Orthodox extremists and the rebellious demonstrations of the Byzantine populace that drove him in 512 to abandon this policy and adopt a monophysitic program of religious unity in the East at the cost of Rome's hostility. His consequent unpopularity in the eastern provinces was utilized by an ambitious man named Vitalian to organize a dangerous rebellion, in which he was assisted by a horde of Huns, 514 to 515. The rebellion was finally suppressed by a naval victory won by the general Marinus. The financial policy of Anastasius was so prudent and economical that it gained him a reputation for avarice and contributed to his unpopularity. He died July 9th, 518. On this day in history, April 12th, 240, Shapur I becomes co-emperor of the Sasanian Empire with his father, Ardashir I. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Shapur. Shapur I, from 241 AD to 272, son of Ardashir I. The Persian legend, which makes him the son of an Arsacid princess, is not historical. Ardashir had, towards the end of his reign, renewed the war against Rome. Shapur conquered the Mesopotamian fortresses Nisibis and Carrhae and advanced into Syria. But he was driven back by C. Phorius Timotheus, father-in-law of the young emperor Gordianus III, and beaten at Racina, 243. Shortly afterwards, Timotheus died, and Gordianus was murdered by Philip the Arabian, who concluded an ignominious peace with the Persians, 244. When the invasion of the Goths and the continuous elevation of new emperors after the death of Decius, 251, brought the Roman Empire to utter dissolution, Shapur resumed his attacks. He conquered Armenia, invaded Syria, and plundered Antioch. At last the Emperor Valerianus marched against him, but suffered near Edessa the fate of Crassus, 260. Shapur advanced into Asia Minor, but was beaten by Ballista, and now Odenath, prince of Palmyra, rose in his rear, defeated the Persian army, reconquered Carrhae and Nisibis, captured the royal harem, and twice invested Ctesiphon, 263 to 265. Shapur was unable to resume the offensive. He even lost Armenia again. But according to Persian and Arabic traditions, which appeared to be trustworthy, he conquered the great fortress of Hatra in the Mesopotamian desert. And the great glory of his reign was that a Roman emperor was by him kept prisoner to the day of his death. In the valley of Istakar, near Persepolis, under the tombs of the Achaemenids at Nakshi Rostam, Shapur is represented on horseback, in the royal armor, with the crown on his head. Before him kneels Valerian, in Roman dress, asking for grace. The same scene is represented on the rocks near the ruins of the towns Darabjar and Shapur in Persis. Shapur left other reliefs and rock inscriptions. One, at Nakshi Rajab, near Persepolis, is accompanied by a Greek translation. Here he calls himself the Mazda-Asinian, worshipper of Ahura-Mazda, the god Sapores, king of kings of the Aryans, Iranians, and non-Aryans, of divine descent, son of the Mazda-Asinian, the god Artaxerxes, king of kings of the Aryans, grandson of the god King Papak. Another long inscription at Hajibad, Ishtkar, mentions the king's exploits in archery, in the presence of his nobles. From his titles we learn that Shapur I claimed the sovereignty over the whole earth, although in reality his domain extended little farther than that of Ardashir I. Shapur built the great town of Gundev Shapur near the old Achaemenian capital Susa, and increased the fertility of this rich district by a barrage through the Quran River near Shuster, which was built by the Roman prisoners and is still called Bandi-i-Caesar, the mole of the Caesar. Under his reign, the prophet Mani, the founder of Manichaeism, began his preaching in Persia, and the king himself seems to have favored his ideas. On this day in history, April 13th, 1111, Henry V is crowned Holy Roman Emperor. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Henry. Henry V, born 1081, died 1125, Roman Emperor, son of the Emperor Henry IV, was born on January 8, 1081, and after the deposition of his elder brother, the German King Conrad, died 1101, was chosen as his successor in 1098. In spite of his oath to take no part in the business of the empire during his father's lifetime, Henry was induced by his father's enemies to revolt in 1104, and some of the princes did homage to him at Mainz in January 1106. In August of the same year, the elder Henry died, and his son became sole ruler. In 1107, a campaign to restore Bolshevik II to the Dukedom of Bohemia was partially successful, and in the year following, the king led his forces into Hungary, where he failed to take Pressburg. In 1109, he was unable to compel the Poles to renew their accustomed tribute, but in 1110 he succeeded in securing the Dukedom of Bohemia from Ladislaus I. The main interest of Henry's reign centers in the controversy over lay investiture, which had been thrice prohibited by Pascal II. In 1110, Henry went to Italy with a large army, and at Sutri concluded an arrangement with Pascal by which he renounced the right of investiture in return for a promise of coronation, and the restoration to the empire of all the lands given by kings or emperors to the German Church since the time of Charlemagne. The king presented himself at St. Peter's on February 12, 1111, for his coronation and the ratification of the treaty. The words commanding the clergy to restore the fiefs of the crown to Henry were read amid a tumult of indignation, whereupon the Pope refused to crown the king, who in turn declined to renounce the right of investiture. Henry then left the city carrying the Pope with him, and Pascal's failure to obtain assistance drew from him a confirmation of the king's right of investiture and a promise to crown him emperor. In 1112, Lothair, Duke of Saxony, rose against Henry, but was easily quelled. In 1113, however, a quarrel over the succession to the counties of Weimar and Orléans gave occasion for a fresh outbreak on the part of Lothair, whose troops were defeated at Warnstadt. Having been married in 1114 to Matilda, or Maud, daughter of Henry I of England, the emperor was confronted with a further rising initiated by the citizens of Cologne, who were soon joined by Saxons and others. Henry's forces were defeated at Helvetius in 1115, and complications in Italy compelled him to leave Germany to the care of Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, Duke of Swabia, and his brother Conrad. After the departure of Henry from Rome in 1111, a council declared the privilege of lay investiture, which had been extorted from Pascal, to be invalid, and Guido, Archbishop of Vienna, excommunicated the emperor, but the Pope refused to ratify this sentence. The quarrel entered upon a new stage in 1115 when Matilda, daughter and heiress of Boniface, Margrave of Tuscany, died, leaving her vast estates to the papacy. Crossing the Alps in 1116, Henry took possession of Matilda's lands. By this time, Pascal had withdrawn his consent to lay investiture, and the excommunication had been published. The Pope was compelled to fly, and the Emperor was crowned a second time by Burdinus, Archbishop of Braga. Pascal was succeeded by Gelasius II in January 1118, but Henry secured the election of an antipope, who took the name of Gregory VIII. Finally, in the Concordat of Worms, September 1122, Henry renounced the right of investiture, with ring and crozier, recognized the freedom of election of the clergy, and promised to restore all church property. The new Pope, Calixtus II, agreed to allow elections to take place in presence of the imperial envoys, and the investiture with the scepter to be granted by the emperor as a symbol that the estates of the church were held under the crown. Henry was received again into the communion of the church, after he had abandoned his nominee Gregory to defeat. The emperor's concluding years were occupied with a campaign in Holland, and with a quarrel over the succession to the Margravate of Messine. In 1124 he led an expedition against King Louis VI of France, and turned his arms against the citizens of Worms. He died at Utrecht on May 23, 1125. On this day in history, April 14, 966, following his marriage to the Christian Dobrovka of Bohemia, the pagan ruler of the Polans, Mieszko I converts to Christianity, an event considered to be the founding of the Polish state. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of early Poland. We possess no certain historical data relating to Poland till the end of the 10th century. The earliest Polish chroniclers are of little help to us. The only facts of importance to be gleaned from them are that Prince Ziemowit, the great-grandfather of Mieszko, Mieczysław I, 962 to 992, wrested from the vast but tottering Moravian Empire the province of Crobakia, extending from the Carpathians to the Bug, and that Christianity was first preached on the Vistula by Greek Orthodox missionary monks. Mieszko himself was converted by Jordan, the chaplain of his Bohemian consort Dobrawa Orbona, who became the first bishop of Poznan. The Slavonic people, whose territories then extended to the Elbe and embraced the whole southern shore of the Baltic, were beginning to recoil before the vigorous impetus of the Germans in the west, and the acceptance of Christianity might give them respite from further attack. This was thoroughly understood by Mieszko's son Boleslaw I, 992 to 1025, who aimed at securing the independence of the Polish Church as an additional guarantee of the independence of the Polish nation, and elevated the church at Gniezno in Great Poland into a metropolitan see, with jurisdiction over the new bishoprics of Kraków, Breslau, and Coburg, created in territory which he had recently conquered. Boleslaw was the first Polish prince to bear the royal title, and his reign resulted in the formation of a vast kingdom extending from the Baltic to the Carpathians, and from the Elbe to the Bug. In the next generation, much of the territory which he had won was lost, and Poland itself was ravaged by neighboring enemies. But under Boleslaw II, 1058 to 79, and Boleslaw III, 1102 to 39, some of the lost provinces, notably Silesia and Pomerania, were recovered, and Poland was at least able to maintain her independence against the Germans. Boleslaw III, moreover, with the aid of St. Otto, Bishop of Bamberg, succeeded in converting the heathen Pomeranians, 1124 to 28, and making head against paganism generally. On this day in history, April 15th, 1071, Bari, the last Byzantine possession in southern Italy, is surrendered to Robert Guiscard. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of the city. Bari, also known as Barium, an archiepiscopal see in Apulia, Italy, capital of the province of Bari, on a small peninsula, 69 miles northwest of Brindisi, by rail. Population, from 1815, about 15,000. From 1901, 77,478. From 1936, 162,238. In the town, 197,918 in the commune. The closely built old town is on the peninsula to the north, and the new town to the south is laid out rectangularly. The former contains the Cathedral of St. Sabino, begun in 1034, destroyed in 1156, and rebuilt in 1170 to 78. The exterior preserves, in the main, the fine original architecture, notably the dome and the campanile. The Church of St. Nicola was founded in 1087 to receive the relics of this saint, brought from Myra in Lycia, and now beneath the altar in the crypt. The facade is fine, and the interior is divided into 3 naves by columns, with galleries over the aisles, has fortunately not been restored. The church is one of the 4 Palatine churches of Apulia, the others being the cathedrals of Acquaviva and Altamora, and the church of Mont St. Angelo sul Gargano. The small church of St. Gregorio belongs also to the 11th century. The castle, built 1233-40 by Frederick II, and strengthened in the 16th century, lies on the west side of the old town. The old harbor lies on the east side of the peninsula, and the new on the west. In 1930, a yearly fair of the Fiera del Levante was inaugurated in Bari to strengthen Italy's ties with the Balkans and the Near East. In the fair of 1937, 3,137 Italians and 1,624 foreigners took part. Bari is the home port of the Puglia line. In the new town is the Ateneo, containing the provincial museum with Hellenic collections and a large theater. Bari is the seat of command of the 9th Army Corps, and the most important commercial town in Apulia. It manufactures olive oil, soap, carbon sulfide, tiles, oriental carpets, and playing cards, and has a large iron foundry and important flour mills. In Roman times, Barium was the junction between the coast road and the Via Traiana. Its harbor, mentioned as early as 180 BC, was the principal one of the district, as at present, and was the center of a fishery. It became in 852 a seat of Saracen power, and in 885 the residence of the Byzantine governor of Apulia. In 1071 it was captured by Robert Guiscard. Some of the Norman Crusaders crossed thence to Constantinople in 1096-97. In 1156 it was razed to the ground, but acquired new prosperity under Frederick II. After this it was under various masters, last of all the Sforzas, 1464 to 1557, and after the death of Bona Sforza, widow of Sigismund I of Poland, it was assigned to Naples by arbitration of the emperor. On this day in history, April 16, 1582, Spanish conquistador Hernando de Lerma founds the settlement of Salta, Argentina. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the city. Salta, a city of Argentina, capital of a province of the same name, and see of a bishopric, on a small tributary, the Aray, of the Passage or Jormento, 976 miles by rail north by northwest of Buenos Aires. Population 38,574. Salta is built on an open plain, 3,560 feet above the sea, nearly enclosed with mountains. The climate is warm and malarial in summer, but mild and pleasant in winter. Nearby is the battlefield where General Belgrano won the first victory from the Spanish forces, 1812, in the War of Independence. There is the large mestizo element in the population, and the Spanish element still retains many of the characteristics of its colonial ancestors. Salta was founded in 1582 by Governor Abreu under the title of San Clemente de Nueva Sevilla, but the site was changed 2 years later, and the new settlement was called San Felipe de Lerma. In the 17th century, the name Salta came into vogue. On this day in history, April 17, 1521, the trial of Martin Luther over his teachings begins during the assembly of the Diet of Worms. Initially intimidated, he asks for time to reflect before answering and is given a stay of 1 day. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Worms. Worms was known in Roman times as Borbeto Magus, which in the Merovingian age became Wormatia. The town had before Caesar's time become the capital of a German tribe, the Vangiones. Drusus is said to have erected a fort here in 14 BC. In 413, the Emperor Jovinus permitted the Burgundians under their king Guntar, or Gunther, to settle on the left bank of the Rhine between the Lauter and the Ney. Here they founded a kingdom with Worms as its capital. Adopting Arianism, they came into conflict with the Romans, and under their king, Gundar, or Gundekar, the Gunther of Nibelungenlied, rose in 435 against the Roman governor Aetius, who called in the Huns against them. The destruction of Worms and the Burgundian kingdom by the Huns in 436 was the subject of heroic legends afterwards incorporated in the Nibelungenlied and the Rosengarten, an epic probably of the late 13th century. Worms was rebuilt by the Merovingians and became an episcopal see, first mentioned in 614, although a bishop of the Vangiones had attended a council at Cologne as early as 347. There was a royal palace from the 8th century, and in it the Frankish kings, including Charlemagne, occasionally resided. Under the German kings, the power of the bishops of Worms gradually increased. Otto I granted extensive lands to the bishop, and in 979, Bishop Hildebold acquired comital rights in his city. Burchard I, bishop from 1000 to 1025, destroyed the castle of the Franconian house at Worms, built the cathedral, and laid the foundations of the subsequent territorial power of the see. There were frequent struggles between the bishops and the citizens, who espoused the cause of the emperors against the church, and were rewarded by privileges which fostered trade. The city retained its freedom until 1801, in spite of the bishops, who ruled a small territory south of the city, on both sides of the Rhine, and resided at Ladenburg near Mannheim till 1622. The city of Worms was frequently visited by the imperial court. The Concordat of Worms closed the investiture controversy in 1122. Their perpetual peace, Ewiger Landsfrei, was proclaimed by the Emperor Maximilian I at the Diet of 1495, and Luther appeared before the famous Diet of 1521 to defend his doctrines in the presence of Charles V. 4 years later, Worms formally embraced Protestantism, and religious conferences were held there in 1540 and 1557. It suffered severely during the 30 Years' War. The French under Mellac burned the city almost entirely in 1689, and it only fully recovered from this blow in recent years. Thus, the population, which in its prosperous days is said to have exceeded 50,000, had sunk in 1815 to 6,250. By the Treaty of Worms in 1743, an offensive alliance was formed between Great Britain, Austria, and Sardinia. The city was annexed to France at a Peace of Luneville in 1801, together with the bishop's territories on the left bank of the Rhine. The remaining episcopal domains were secularized in 1803 and given to Hesse-Darmstadt, which acquired the whole by the Vienna Congress in 1815. On this day in history, April 18th, 1518, Bona Sforza is crowned as Queen Consort of Poland. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the Sforza family. Sforza, the name of a famous Italian family. They were descended from a peasant condottiere, Giacomo Ormuzio, sometimes abbreviated into Giacomuso, at Tendalo, who was born at Contignola in the Romagna on June 10, 1369, gained command of a band of adventurers by whom he had been kidnapped, took the name of Sforza in the field, became constable of Naples under Joanna II, fought bravely against the Spaniards, served Pope Martin V, by whom he was created a Roman count, and was drowned on January 4, 1424, in the Pescara near Aquila, while engaged in a military expedition. His natural son, Francesco, 1401 to 1466, served the Visconti against the Venetians, and then the Venetians against the Visconti. He attacked the Pope, deprived him of the Romagna, and later defended him. He married in 1441 Bianca, the only daughter of Filippo Maria Visconti, Duke of Milan, and received Pontremoli and Sermona as dowry, as the promise of succession to the Duchy of Milan. The short-lived Ambrosian Republic, which was established by the Milanese on the death of Visconti, 1447, was overthrown by Francesco, who made his triumphal entry as Duke of Milan on March 25, 1450. His court, filled with Italian scholars and Greek exiles, speedily became one of the most splendid in Italy. His daughter, Ippolita, was renowned for her Latin discourses. Francesco left several sons, among whom was Galazzo Maria, Ludovico, and Ascanio, who became a cardinal. Galazzo Maria, who succeeded to the duchy, was born in 1444, and was a lover of art, eloquent in speech, but dissolute and cruel. He was assassinated at the porch of the cathedral on December 26, 1476, by 3 young Milanese noblemen desirous of imitating Brutus and Cassius. His daughter, Caterina, is separately noticed. Gian Galazzo, 1469 to 1494, son of Galazzo, succeeded to the duchy under the regency of his mother, Bona of Savoy, who was supplanted in her power, 1481, by the boy's uncle, Ludovico the Moor. Gian Galazzo married Isabella of Aragon, granddaughter of the King of Naples, and his sudden death was attributed by some to the poison administered by the regent. His daughter, Bona Sforza, 1493 to 1557, married King Sigismund of Poland in 1518. On the death of her husband, she returned to Italy and was poisoned 1557 by her paramour, Papacoda. Ludovico the Moor, or Ludovico il Moro, 1451 to 1508, who is famed as patron of Leonardo da Vinci and other artists, had summoned Charles VIII of France to his aid, 1494, and received the ducal crown from the Milanese nobles on October 22nd in the same year. But finding his own position endangered by the French policy, he joined the League against Charles VIII, giving his niece Bianca in marriage to Maximilian I, and receiving in return imperial investiture of the duchy. Ludovico was driven from Milan by Louis VII in 1499, and although reinstated for a short time by the Swiss, he was eventually delivered over by them to the French, April 1500, and died a prisoner in the castle of Laux. Francesco, son of Gian Galazzo, taken to France by Louis VII, became abbot of Marmoutiers, and died in 1511. The 2 sons of Ludovico, Massimiliano and Francesco Maria, took refuge in Germany. The former was restored to the Duchy of Milan by the Swiss in 1512, But after the overwhelming defeat of his allies at Marignano, 1515, he abandoned his rights to Francis I and died in Paris in 1530. The latter was put in possession of Milan after the defeat of the French at La Bicocca in 1522. His death, October 24, 1535, marked the extinction of the ducal male line of the Sforza. The duchy went to Charles V. The Dukes of Sforza Cesarini, Rome, are descended from Bosio, younger brother of Francesco, the first Duke of Milan. Bosio had become Grand Connetable of the popes. The Counts of Sforza, Lungiana, are descended from Sforza II, a younger son of the said Francesco and a general in his father's armies.
On this day in history, April 19th, 1560, Philip Melanchthon, German theologian and reformer, dies. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the theologian. Philip Melanchthon, born 1497, died 1560. German theologian and reformer, was born at Bretten in Baden on February 16, 1497. His father, George Schwarzerd, was an armorer under the Palatine princes. His mother, Barbara Ruther, a niece of Johann Reuchlin, was shrewd, thrifty, and affectionate. Reuchlin took an interest in the boy and, following a contemporary custom, named him Melanchthon, the Greek form of Schwarzerd, black earth. In October 1509 he went to Heidelberg, where he took the B.A. degree, afterwards proceeding M.A. at Tübingen. The only other academic distinction he accepted was the B.D. of Wittenberg, 1519. The Elector of Saxony called him to Wittenberg as professor of Greek in 1518. Wittenberg became the school of the nation. The scholastic methods of instruction were set aside, and in a discourse on reforming the studies of youth, Melanchthon gave proof, not only that he had caught the Renaissance spirit, but that he was fitted to become one of its foremost leaders. He began to lecture on Homer and the Epistle to Titus. Luther received a fresh impulse towards the study of Greek, and his translation of the Scriptures began as early as 1517, now made rapid progress, Melanchthon helping to collate the Greek versions and revising Luther's translation. Melanchthon felt the spell of Luther's personality. Melanchthon was first drawn into the arena of the Reformation controversy through the Leipzig Disputation, June 27th to July 8th, 1519, at which he was present. He had been reproved by Johann Eck for giving aid to Karlstadt, and was soon afterwards himself attacked by Eck. Melanchthon replied in a brief and moderately worded treatise, setting forth Luther's first principle of the supreme authority of Scripture in opposition to the parasitic writings on which Eck relied. His marriage in 1520 to Catherine Krapp of Wittenberg gave a domestic center to the Reformation. In 1521, during Luther's confinement in the Wartburg, Melanchthon was leader of the Reformation cause at the university. With the arrival of the Anabaptist enthusiasts of Zwickau, he wavered. Their attacks on infant baptism seemed to him not altogether irrational, and in regard to their claim to personal inspiration, he said, "Luther alone can decide, on the one hand, let us beware of quenching the Spirit of God, and on the other, being led astray by the spirit of Satan." In the same year, 1521, he published his Loci Communis Rerum Theologicarum, the first systemized presentation of the Reformed theology. In 1522 to 1524, he was busy with the translation of the Bible and in publishing commentaries. In 1524, he went for reasons of health into southern Germany and was urged by the papal legate, Campeggio, to renounce the new doctrines. He refused, and maintained his refusal by submitting his Summa Doctrina Lutheri. After the First Diet of Spires, 1526, where a precarious peace was patched up for the Reformed faith, Melanchthon was deputed as one of 28 commissioners to visit the Reformed states and regulate the constitution of churches, he having just published a famous treatise called the Libellus Visitatorius, a directory for the use of the commissioners. At the Marburg Conference, 1529, between the German and Swiss reformers, Luther was pitted against Oeclampedius and Melanchthon against Zwingli, in the discussion regarding the real presence in the sacrament. How far the normally conciliatory spirit of Melanchthon was here biased by Lutherans' intolerance is evident from the exaggerated accounts of the conference written by the former to the Elector of Saxony. He was at this time even more embittered than Luther against the Zwinglians. At the Diet of Augsburg, 1530, Melanchthon was the leading representative of the Reformation, and it was he who prepared for that Diet the 17 Articles of the Evangelical Faith, which are known as the Augsburg Confession. He held conferences with Roman divines, appointed to adjust differences, and afterwards wrote an apology for the Augsburg Confession. After the Augsburg Conference, further attempts were made to settle the Reformation controversy by a compromise, and Melanchthon, from his conciliatory spirit and facility of access, appeared to the defenders of the old faith the fittest of the reformers to deal with. His historical instinct led him ever to revert to the original unity of the Church and to regard subsequent errors as excrescence rather than proofs of an anti-Christian system. The year after Luther's death, when the Battle of Mühlberg, 1547, had given a seemingly crushing blow to the Protestant cause, an attempt was made to weld together the evangelical and papal doctrines, which resulted in the compilation by Pflug, Sidonius, and Agricola of the Augsburg Interim. This was proposed to the two parties in Germany as a provisional ground of agreement pending the decision of the Council of Trent. Melanchthon, on being referred to, declared that, though the interim was inadmissible, yet so far as matters of indifference, adiaphora, were concerned, it might be received. The fact is that Melanchthon sought not to minimize differences, but to veil them under an international obscurity of expression. Thus he allowed the necessity of good works to salvation, but not in the old sense, proposed to allow the 7 sacraments, but only as rites which had no inherent efficacy to salvation, and so on. He afterwards retracted his compliance with the adiaphora, and never really swerved from the views set forth in the Loci Communes. His later years were occupied with controversies within the evangelical church and fruitless conferences with his Roman adversaries. He died in his 63rd year on April 19, 1560, and his body was laid beside that of Martin Luther in the Schlosskirche at Wittenberg. His ready pen, clear thought, and elegant style made him the scribe of the Reformation, most public documents on that side being drawn up by him. He never attained entire independence of Luther, though he gradually modified some of his positions from those of the pure Lutheranism with which he set out. His development is chiefly noteworthy in regard to these 2 leading points: the relation of the Evangelium, or doctrine of free grace, to free will and moral ability, and to the law and poenitentia, or the good works connected with repentance. At first, Luther's cardinal doctrine of grace appeared to Melanchthon inconsistent with any view of free will, and following Luther he renounced Aristotle and philosophy in general, since philosophers attribute everything to human power, while the sacred writings represent all moral power as lost by the fall. In the first edition of the Loci, 1521, he held to the length of fatalism, the Augustinian doctrine of irresistible grace, working according to God's immutable decrees, and denied freedom of will in matters civil and religious alike. In the Augsburg Confession, 1530, which was largely due to him, freedom is claimed for the will in non-religious matters, and in the Loci of 1533, he calls the denial of freedom Stoicism, and holds that in justification there is a certain casualty, though not worthiness, in the recipient subordinate to the divine casualty. In 1535, combating Laurentius Valla, he did not deny the spiritual incapacity of the will per se, but held that this is strengthened by the Word of God, to which it can cleave. The will cooperates with the Word and the Holy Spirit. Finally, in 1543, he says that the cause of the difference of final destiny among men lies in the different method of treating grace which is possible to believers as to others. Man may pray to help and to reject grace. This he calls free will, as the power of laying hold of grace. Melanchthon's doctrine of the three concurrent causes in conversion, viz., the Holy Spirit, the Word, and the human will, suggested the semi-Pelagian position called synergism, which was held by some of his immediate followers. In regard to the relation of grace to repentance and good works, Luther was disposed to make faith itself the principle of sanctification. Melanchthon, however, for whom ethics possessed a special interest, laid more stress on the law. He began to do this in 1527 in the Libellus Visitatorius, which urges pastors to instruct their people in the necessity of repentance, and to bring the threatenings of the law to bear upon men in order to instill faith. This brought upon him the opposition of the antinomian Johannes Agricola. In the Loci of 1535, Melanchthon sought to put the fact of the coexistence of justification and good works in the believer on a secure basis by declaring the latter necessary to eternal life, though the believer's destiny thereto is already fully guaranteed in his justification. In the Loci of 1543, he did not retain the doctrine of necessity of good works to obtain salvation, and to this he added, in the Leipzig Interim, that this in no way countenances the error that eternal life is merited by the worthiness of our own works. Melanchthon was led to lay more and more stress upon the law and moral ideas, but the basis of the relation of faith and good works was never clearly brought out by him, and he at length fell back on his original position, that we have justification and inheritance of bliss in and by Christ alone, and that good works are necessary by reason of immutable divine command. On this day in history, April 20th, 1534, Elizabeth Barton, English nun and martyr, dies. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the martyr. Elizabeth Barton, born circa 1506, died 1534. The Maid of Kent was, according to her own testament, born in 1506 at Aldington, Kent. In 1525, when she was a servant in the house of Thomas Cobb, steward of an estate near Aldington, owned by William Warham, Archbishop of Canterbury, she had an illness, after which she passed into trances and uttered prophecies. Cobb reported the matter to the parish priest, who in turn acquainted Archbishop Warham. After her recovery, the girl continued to feign trances, and as her fame steadily grew, the Archbishop in 1526 instructed the prior of Christ Church, Canterbury, to send 2 of the monks to hold an inquiry into the case. One of these latter, Edward Barking, obtained her admission as a nun to St. Sepulchre's Convent, Canterbury. Under Barking's instruction, Barton's prophecies became still more remarkable, and attracted many pilgrims, who believed her to be in direct communication with the Virgin Mary. Her utterances were directed towards political matters, and she declared that should Henry persist in his intention of divorcing Catherine, he should no longer be king of this realm, and should die a villain's death. Even such men as Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, and Sir Thomas More corresponded with Barton. In 1532, Henry passed through Canterbury, and is said to have seen the nun, who tried to terrify him into abandoning his marriage. After its solemnization in May 1533, her utterances becoming still more treasonable, she was examined before Cranmer and confessed. In January 1534, by a bill of attainder, the maid and her chief accomplices were condemned to death, and they were executed at Tyburn on April 20th. On this day in history, April 21st, 753 BC, Romulus founds Rome. This is the traditional date. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Romulus. Romulus, the son of Mars by the Vestal Rhea Silvia, or Ilia, daughter of Numitor, who had been dispossessed of the throne of Alba by his younger brother Amulus. Romulus and Remus, the twin sons of Silvia, were placed in a trough and cast into the Tiber by their granduncle. The trough grounded in the marshes where Rome afterwards stood, under the wild fig tree, Ficus ruminalis, which was still holy in later days. The babes were suckling by a she-wolf and fed by a woodpecker, and then fostered by Acca Laurentia, wife of the shepherd Faustulus. They became leaders of a warlike band of shepherds on the Palatine,
and in course of time were recognized by their grandfather, whom they restored to his throne, slaying Amulius. They now founded a city on the site where they had been nurtured. Later a quarrel broke out and Remus was slain. Romulus strengthened his band by offering an asylum to outcasts and fugitives, found wives for them by capture, and waged war with their kinsmen. His most formidable foe was Titus Tatus, king of the Sabines. But after an obstinate struggle, he and Romulus united their forces and reigned side by side till Tatus was slain at Lavinium in the course of a blood feud with Laurentum. Romulus then reigned alone till he suddenly disappeared in a storm. He was thereafter worshipped as a god under the name of Quirnus. Various rationalizing accounts also exist of the legend. The whole story, probably first given by the annalist Fabius Pictor and Cincius Alimentus, is artificial and shows strong Greek influence. The birth, exposure, rescue, and subsequent adventures of the twins are a Greek tale of a familiar type. Mars and his sacred beast, the wolf, are introduced on account of the great importance of this cult. The localities described are ancient sacred places. The Lupercal, near the Ficus Ruminalis, was naturally explained as the she-wolf's den. The asylum is pure Greek, both name and institution. The story was probably invented to give an explanation of the sacred spot named Inter Doas Lucas, between the Arcs and the Capitol. Another Greek touch is the deification of an eponymous hero. The rape of the Sabine women is clearly aetiological, invented to account for the custom of simulated capture and marriage. These women, and also Titus Tatus, represent the Sabine element in the Roman population. The name Romulus means simply Roman. The derivation of Remus is obscure. Romulus is regarded as the founder of the military and political institutions, as Numa and his counterpart, Ancus Marcius, are of the religious institutions of Rome.
On this day in history, April 22nd, 1500, Portuguese navigator Pedro Álvares Cabral lands in Brazil. The discovery of Brazil. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the discovery and settlement of Brazil. The discovery and early settlement of Brazil appears in the larger perspective of history as episodes in the great movement of Portuguese colonial expansion of the East. Vasco da Gama's discovery of an all-water route to the Indies and Spice Islands by the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 led the Portuguese crown to dispatch to India an imposing armada under Pedro Álvares Cabral, whose sailing directions had been drawn up by great Vasco himself. To avoid the calms off the Gulf of Guinea, Cabral bore so far to the west that on April 22, 1500, the mainland of South America was sighted and the region was promptly claimed by Portugal, as it lay well within the zone assigned Portugal by the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494. The coast of Brazil had been touched early in the year 1500 by the Spanish navigator Vicente Yanez Pinzon, but the Spanish crown made no effort to follow up the discovery. Portugal's new possession was at first called the Island of the True Cross, a name soon abandoned in favor of Brazil after the valuable dyewood in which the country abounded. The tidings of Cabral's discovery aroused great enthusiasm and further explorations were undertaken. According to the generally accepted account, the first of these expeditions, which set sail on May 10, 1501, had as its pilot Amerigo Vespucci, who had already been once and possibly twice to the New World. As the little fleet sailed along the coast of Brazil, whose immense extent was for the first time realized, Vespucci, calendar in hand, baptized the different points on the coast with the names of the saints on those days they were discovered. A majority of these names, ergo Cape São Agostinho, São Francisco River, have remained to the present day. It is probable that the spacious bay of Guanabara was entered on January 1st, 1502, and named Rio de Janeiro. For over a quarter of a century following Vespucci's voyage, interest in Brazil all but ceased. No precious metals were discovered, and the energies of the Portuguese were increasingly absorbed by the establishment of a great empire in the East. Portugal's enemies and rivals, especially the French, were quick to take advantage of this neglect. Swift corsairs from Honfleur and Dieppe loaded their ships with the valuable Brazil wood, and even attacked Portuguese vessels returning from the Indies. Brazil became a sort of no man's land over which the Portuguese crown wielded only a shadowy control. This apathy ended, however, with the ascension of John III, 1521 to 1557, and the center of gravity in colonial affairs gradually shifted from Asia to America. The first systematic effort to establish an organized government in Brazil was made in 1532. Brazil was divided into 15 hereditary captaincies or fiefs, extending 50 leagues along the coast and an indefinite distance inland. These grants were distributed to favored persons, chiefly courtiers, who took name of donatarios. Their rights and privileges were extensive. They were authorized to found cities, issue land grants, levy internal taxes, and appoint municipal officers. To the crown was reserved the right to impose export taxes and the monopoly of Brazil wood and spices. The captaincy system failed to realize the hopes of the crown. Only 10 of these fiefs were occupied by their owners, and of these only 2 were really successful. The most flourishing of the settlements was that of São Vicente, south of the present city of Santos. This had been granted to Martim Afonso de Sousa, who in 1530 had explored the coast as far south as the La Plata estuary and had penetrated for some distance into the interior. By the middle of the century, the captaincy had a population of some 5,000, including the growing port of Santos and the town of São Paulo, over the edge of the Serra do Mor, on the fertile plateau of Piratininga. In northern Brazil, Duarte Coelho had converted the captaincy of Pernambuco into a great sugar-producing region. But the remaining captaincies were for the most part tragic failures. The donatarios were generally incompetent and tyrannical, and the struggling settlements were powerless against attacks of hostile Indians or the depredations of French corsairs. On this day in history, April 23rd, 1016, Edmund Ironside succeeds his father, Ethelred the Unready, as King of England. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Edmund. Edmund, or Eadmund, circa 980 to 1016, called Ironside, King of the English, was the son of Ethelred II, the Unready, by his wife Emma, or Ealgifu. When Canute invaded England in 1015, Edmund was betrayed and deserted by the ealdorman Edric, who went over to Canute, and Wessex submitted to the Danish king. Next year, Canute and Edric together harried Mercia, while Edmund, with infinite difficulty, gathered an army. His attack on the invaded districts of Northumbria was brought to an end by Canute's northward march, and he was forced to return to London. The death of Ethelred on April 23, 1016, was followed by a double election to the English crown. The citizens of London chose Edmund. The rest of the Witten meeting at Southampton elected Canute. In the warfare which ensued, Edmund fought at the severest disadvantage, for his armies dispersed after every engagement. Canute besieged London, but the citizens successfully resisted all attacks. Edmund, meanwhile, received the submission of Wessex. At Penn in Somersetshire, he engaged the Danes and defeated them. Canute now raised the siege of London, and, after being defeated by Edmund at Penn, came into conflict with him again at Shurston and Wiltshire. The battle was indecisive, but Canute left Edmund in possession of Wessex. Edmund hastened after him and relieved London, which Canute was besieging. He defeated the Danes at Brentford and at Otford, and drove them into Sheppey. He was now joined by Edric, with whom he followed the Danes into Essex, overtaking them at Assendam, or Ashington. In the battle which ensued, Edric again played the traitor, and the English were routed. Edmund retired into Gloucestershire, whither he was followed by Canute. Edric and the Witten then persuaded Edmund to accept a reconciliation, which took place at Olney. The kingdom was divided, Canute taking the north, Edmund the south. Soon afterwards, Edmund died, November 30th, 1016, probably from natural causes, though later historians hint at foul play. On this day in history, April 24th, 1547, at the Battle of Mulberg, Duke of Alba, commanding Spanish imperial forces of Charles I of Spain, defeats the troops of the Schmalkaldic League. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Mulberg, a town of Germany, in Prussian Saxony, on the left bank of the Elbe, 8 miles below the Rhisia, population of 1933,
3597. It manufactures bricks, baskets, and matches. Mulberg is famous for the victory gained here in 1547 by the Emperor Charles V over the Elector of Saxony, John Frederick.
On this day in history, April 25th, 404 BC, Admiral Lysander and King Pausanias of Sparta blockade Athens and bring the Peloponnesian War to a successful conclusion. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over Athens' downfall and the end of the Peloponnesian War. Sparta at last discovered a great admiral in Lysander. Coming to his naval base at Ephesus in the autumn of 408 BC, he built up a large, well-equipped fleet assisted by the new satrap, Prince Cyrus, second son of the Persian king, who cooperated enthusiastically with the Spartan, placing Persia's illimitable resources and his own private purse at the latter's command. Persian vacillation thus ended. The only flaw in Sparta's naval organization was the rule forbidding the same man to hold the admiral's office in 2 consecutive years. In 407 BC, Lysander resisted steadily all Alcibiades' efforts to entice him out to battle. Then that weakness, shortage of supplies, which hampered all Athenian operations in the Ionian War, compelled Alcibiades to divide his fleet. He himself sailed north to plunder enemy coast towns, leaving in observation at Notium a squadron under one Antiochus, a good seaman and an old friend from boyhood, with strict orders not to offer battle. During his superior's absence at hostile Cyme, Antiochus challenged Lysander insultingly to combat. The latter sallied out of harbor and routed him. Alcibiades returned and renewed the blockade of the foe, but the mischief was done. His personal enemies at Athens persuaded the people to dismiss him from his command. He withdrew quietly to a castle on the Hellespont, and a new board of generals next year replaced him. Lysander, too, was superseded by Callicratidas, a brave and energetic officer. The latter, overcoming all hindrances placed in his way by Lysander and Cyrus, blockaded the Athenian Conon in Mytilene harbor. A large Athenian fleet, raised with desperate energy, sailed from Piraeus to this general's succor. At the resulting Battle of Arginae in August 406 BC, the fleets engaged were the largest hitherto seen on both sides in the war, but the tactics were nearly as clumsy as in the days before Phormio. Callicratidas was defeated heavily, and he himself was downed. Again, Sparta offered peace. Again, Celephon, in drunken madness, secured its rejection. The very victory was marred by a failure, due in part only to heavy weather, to rescue many hundred drowning Athenian soldiers from sinking or waterlogged ships. The generals were recalled to Athens. 6 who obeyed were put on trial, and illegally condemned en bloc were executed. Theramenes, whom they had tried to make their scapegoat, being largely responsible for their doom. By their removal, he may have hoped to achieve Alcibiades' recall even at the 11th hour. In this he failed. The new generals of 405 BC were, with one exception, Alcibiades' political opponents. These, proceeding to Ionia, moved the entire fleet up to the open roadstead of Aegospotamia in the Hellespont. Lysander lay opposite in security at Abydos. In vain, Alcibiades rode down to warn his compatriots of their perilous position. Insults rewarded this, the last of many efforts to save his city. By a clever ruse de guerre, Lysander in September 405 BC captured the whole of the opposing fleet without a blow, and in one single hour brought the longest of wars to an end. Only Conon and some 20 Athenian ships escaped. So Athens lost her fleet, and with it the war, thanks to incompetence and political partisanship combined. With slow deliberation, Lysander sailed upon the city and blockaded Piraeus. King Pausanias lay with his army outside the walls. After 6 terrible months of slow starvation, Theramenes secured terms from Sparta tolerable compared with the utter destruction of the city demanded by Corinth and Thebes. On April 25, 404 BC, Athens capitulated, and the Spartans marched in. Her long walls were pulled down to the merry sound of flutes. Her empire was dissolved. Samos, alone defiant, was taken. The oligarchy of the 13 tyrants was established at Athens,
and Sirtius, its chief, presently secured the judicial murder of Theramenes in the city and the assassination of Alcibiades at Phrygian Melissa. Liberty returned to Hellas. The Peloponnesian War was ended. With the war, the greatest, if not the happiest days of Athens' history are ended. Her political preeminence passes away. Interest centers rather on Thebes and Macedon in the 4th, and on Achaia and Sparta in the 3rd century. Hence, it is that the Peloponnesian War enjoys such importance in world history. Apart from this, it is the genius of Thucydides which has raised to the rank of a world epic, almost of a world tragedy, a struggle which has seemed to some little better than a petty quarrel of ancient days. On this day in history, April 26, 1478, the Pazzi family attack on Lorenzo de Medici in order to displace the ruling Medici family kills his brother Giuliano during a high mass in Florence Cathedral. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Lorenzo. The younger, the gentler, and less ambitious of the two was quickly removed from the world. Lorenzo seized the reins of the state with a firm grasp. In literary talent he was superior to Cosimo, but as a financier was inferior. In politics he had nobler conceptions and higher ambitions, but he was more easily carried away by his passions, less prudent in his revenge, and more disposed to tyranny. Lorenzo's policy, although prosecuted with less caution, was still the old astute policy initiated by Cosimo. Among his worst enemies were the powerful clan of the Pazzi. They were on the point of inheriting the large property of Giovanni Borromeo, when Lorenzo hurriedly caused a law to be passed that had altered the right of succession. The hatred of the Pazzi was thereby exacerbated to fury. There ensued a desperate quarrel with Pope Sixtus IV. Consequently, the Pazzi and Archbishop Salviati, another enemy of Lorenzo, aided by the nephews of the pontiff, determined to destroy the Medici. On April 26, 1478, while Giuliano and Lorenzo were attending High Mass in the Cathedral of Florence, the former was mortally stabbed by the conspirators, but the latter was able to beat back his assailants and escape into the sacristy. Lorenzo wreaked cruel vengeance upon his foes. Several of the Pazzi and their followers were hanged from the palace windows, others were hacked to pieces, dragged through the streets, and cast into the Arno, while others were condemned to death or sent to exile. The Pope had excommunicated Lorenzo, put Florence under an interdict, and, with the help of the Neapolitan king, made war against the Republic. Lorenzo went to Naples, to the court of King Ferdinand of Aragon, and secured an honorable peace, which soon led to a reconciliation with Sixtus. Thus, at last, Lorenzo found himself complete master of Florence, but, as the Balia changed every 5 years, it was always requisite to secure a new magistracy favorable to his aims. In 1480, Lorenzo compassed the institution of a new council of 70, which was practically a permanent Balia with extended powers, which not only elected the chief magistrates but had also the administration of numerous state affairs. The permanent council of devoted adherents once formed, his security was firmly established. By this means, the chroniclers tell us, liberty was buried, but the chief affairs of the state were always conducted by intelligent and experienced men who promoted the public prosperity. Florence was still called a republic. The old institutions were still preserved, if only in name. Lorenzo was absolute lord of all, and virtually a tyrant. His immorality was scandalous. He kept an army of spies. He frequently meddled in the citizens' most private affairs, and exalted men of the lowest condition to important offices of the state. Yet, as Guicciardini remarks, if Florence was to have a tyrant, she could never have found a better and more pleasant one. In fact, all industry, commerce, and public works made enormous progress. The civil equality of modern states, which was quite unknown to the Middle Ages, was more developed in Florence than in any other city of the world. Even the condition of the peasantry was far more prosperous than elsewhere. Lorenzo's authority was very great throughout the whole of Italy. He was on the friendliest terms with Pope Innocent VIII, from whom he obtained the exaltation of his son Giovanni to the cardinalate at the age of 14. The boy cardinal was afterwards Pope Leo X. From the moment of the decease of Sixtus IV, the union of Florence and Rome became the basis of Lorenzo's foreign policy.
The palace of Lorenzo was the school and resort of illustrious men. Within its walls were trained the two young Medici afterwards known to the world as Leo X and Clement VII, Ficino, Poliziano, Pico della Mirandola, and all members of the Platonic Academy were its constant habitués. It was here that Pulci gave readings of his Morgante, and Michelangelo essayed the first strokes of his chisel. Lorenzo's intellectual powers were on exceptional strength and versatility. He could speak with equal fluency on painting, sculpture, music, philosophy, and poetry. But his crowning superiority over every other Maecenas known to the history lay in his active participation in the intellectual labors that he promoted. He was an elegant prose writer, and a poet of real originality. It is Lorenzo's lasting glory to have been the initiator of the movement for the revival of the national literature in the mother tongue. He died on April 8, 1492. On this day in history, April 27th, 395, Emperor Arcadius marries Aelia Eudoxia, daughter of the Frankish general Flavius Bauto. She becomes one of the more powerful Roman empresses of late antiquity. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the emperor. Arcadius, 378 to 408. Roman emperor, the elder son of Theodosius the Great, was created Augustus in 383, and succeeded his father in 395. The empire was divided between him and his brother Honorius, Honorius governing the two western prefectures, Gaul and Italy, and Arcadius the two eastern, the Orient and Illyricum. There was estrangement between the two governments throughout the reign of Arcadius. Honorius's general, Stilicho, was always on the watch to annex the prefecture of Illyricum. Arcadius was guided at first by the Praetorian prefect Rufinus, and, after his murder, probably instigated by Stilicho, end of 395, by the eunuch Eutropius, executed end of 399. His wife Eudoxia, daughter of the Frank general Bauto, had great influence over him. She died in 404. In the last years of his reign, Anthemius, Praetorian prefect, was his minister. In 395 to 96, the West Goths under Alaric ravaged Greece. In 399 to 400, the Gothic general Gaius, with the aid of partisans in Constantinople, tried to set up a German domination, but he fell after having held the city for 6 months, and the German danger was averted from the east. The banishment in 494 of John Chrysostom, Patriarch of Constantinople, who had offended the empress, had quarreled with the Bishop of Alexandria, was important as determining the supremacy of the emperor to the Patriarch. On this day in history, April 28, 1503, the Battle of Carignola is fought. It is noted as one of the first European battles in history won by small arms fire using gunpowder. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Carignola, a town of Apulia, Italy, in the province of Foggia, 26 miles southeast by rail from the town of Foggia, population of 1936, 37,163 in the town, but in the commune, it's 39,540. It was rebuilt after a great earthquake in 1731. It has a considerable agricultural trade and also trade in merino and mattress wool. In 1503, the Spaniards under Galonzo de Cordoba defeated the Spanish under Duc de Nemours below the town, a victory which made the kingdom of Naples into a Spanish province in Italy. Carignola lies on the Via Traiana between Herdonai and Canasium. On this day in history, April 29th, 1429, Joan of Arc arrives to relieve the siege of Orléans. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Orléans. Orléans, the chief town of Lorette, on the Loire, 77 miles south by southwest of Paris by rail. Population, from 1936, 70,780. Les Aubrais, a mile to the north, is one of the chief railway junctions in the country. An early trading post among the Gauls, Orléans was known as Genabum by the Romans, and led the revolt against Julius Caesar in 52 BC. In the 5th century, it had taken the name Aurelianum, from either Marcus Aurelius or Aurelian. It was vainly besieged in 451 by Attila,
and by Odoacer in 471, but Clovis took it in 498 and held it there in 511, the first ecclesiastical council assembled in France. It then became the capital of a separate kingdom, but was united with that of Paris in 613. In the 10th century, the town was taken in fief to the Counts of Paris, who in 987 ousted the Carolingians. Philip, fifth son of Philip VI, was the first Duke of Orléans. After the assassination of his successor, Louis, the people of Orléans sided with the Armagnacs, and thus brought upon themselves the attacks of the Burgundians and the English. Joan of Arc relieved the city in 1429. In 1562 it became the headquarters of Louis I of Bourbon, Prince of Conde, the Protestant commander-in-chief. In 1563, Francis, Duke of Guise, laid siege to it, but was assassinated. Orléans was surrendered to the king, who raised the fortifications. It was held by the Huguenots from 1567 to 1568. The St. Bartholomew massacre there, in 1572, lasted a week. It was given as a lieu de sûreté to the League under Henry III, but surrendered to Henry IV in person in 1594. The town is surrounded by boulevards and is connected with the suburbs of St. Marcau by an 18th century stone bridge of 9 arches. The river is canalized on the right and serves as a continuation of the Orléans Canal. In the Place de Montreuil is a statue of Joan of Arc. A simple cross marks the site on the left bank of the Loire of the Fort des Tourelles, captured by Joan of Arc in 1429. The Cathedral of St. Croix, begun in 1287, was burned by the Huguenots in 1567 before its completion. Henry IV, in 1601, laid the first stone, the building of which continued until 1829. The Church of St. Agnon, mutilated by the Protestants, consists of a transcript and a choir of the second half of the 15th century. It contains in a gilded and carved wooden shrine the remains of its patron saint. Saint Ouvert, dedicated to one of the oldest bishops of Orléans, died 391, is an early Gothic building dating from the 13th, completely restored in the 15th century. The Church of St. Paul, 15th and 16th century, has an isolated tower, and the Notre Dame de Recouvrance was built between 1517 and 1519 in the Renaissance style and dedicated to the memory of the deliverance of the city. The Hôtel de Ville, built under Francis I and Henry II and restored in the 19th century, was formerly the residence of the governors of Orléans and was occupied by the kings and queens of France from Francis II to Henry IV. The public library comprises among its manuscripts a number dating from the 7th century. The Salle des Fêtes, formerly the Corn Market, stands within a vast cloister formed by 15th century arcades, once belonging to the old cemetery. Among old houses are that of Agnes Sorel, 15th and 16th centuries, containing objects relating to Joan of Arc, that of Francis I, of the first half of the 16th century, that occupied by Joan of Arc during the siege of 1429, and that known as the House of Diane de Poitiers, 16th century, which contains the Historical Museum. The anniversary of the raising of the siege in 1429 by Joan of Arc is celebrated yearly. Orléans is the seat of a bishopric under the Archbishop of Paris, a prefect, a court of appeal, and a court of assizes and headquarters of the 5th Army Corps. The more important industries are the manufacture of tobacco by the state, blankets, pins, vinegar, machinery, agricultural implements, hosiery, tools, and ironware, and the preparation of preserved vegetables. Wine, wool, grain, and livestock are commercial staples, round which there are important nurseries. On this day in history, April 30th, 1315, Enguerrand de Marigny is hanged at the instigation of Charles, Count of Valois. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of Enguerrand. Enguerrand de Marigny, born 1260, died 1315, French statesman, was born at Lyon-la-Forêt in Normandy. After the death of Pierre Follet and Hughes de Bonneville at the Battle of Monin-Pevel in 1304, he became Philip IV's Grand Chamberlain and Chief Minister. In 1306 he was sent to preside over the exchequer of Normandy. He received numerous gifts of land and money from Philip, as well as a pension from Edward II of England. He was an able instrument of Philip's policy, and shared the popular odium which Philip incurred by debasing the coinage. He obtained rich appointments for many of his relatives, and secured increased revenue for the king. His peace with the Flemings in 1314 disappointed the princes of the blood. He was accused of receiving bribes, and Charles of Valois denounced him to the king himself, but Philip stood by him. After the death of Philip IV on November 29, 1314, the feudal party, whose power the king had tried to limit, turned on his ministers, and chiefly on his chamberlain. Enguerrand was arrested, and 28 articles of accusation, including charges of receiving bribes, were brought against him. He refused a hearing, but his accounts were correct, and Louis was inclined to spare him anything more than banishment to the island of Cyprus. Charles of Valois then brought forward a charge of sorcery. Enguerrand was condemned at once and hanged on the public gallows at Montfaucon, protesting that in all his acts he had only been carrying out Philip's commands. April 30th, 1315.